Hi, in this module we are going to see how to create a custom interface asset in .NET. Before we start, some important information. .NET interface assets will only work in Player for Windows and in Composer. If you're looking to create an interface set for a different platform, please have a look at our module about custom interface assets written in JavaScript. Second, some development skills and Visual Studio environment knowledge are required to follow this module. First, let's have a look at how to create your interface set in Visual Studio, how to write the code. We are using the free edition of Microsoft Visual Studio Community 2019. In Visual Studio, you can create a new project, and we are going to need a class library targeting the .NET framework. This is important. .NET framework, not .NET standard. Create your project, give it a name, and specify a location. We will take the example of a random number generator. Hit create. The first thing you want to do is to rename your main class. This will be the main one visible as an interface asset in Composer. So let's rename this one into our random number generator. And then let's have a look at our documentation. You will find in this Help Center article all the information you need to create your .NET interface asset. Among these sections, the best practices are very important, and we are going to start by implementing this interface, the iNotify property changed. As soon as you're going to change a property in your code, you want the visual bound to this property to be updated within the experience. To make this happen, the easiest way is to implement this interface. You can reuse this sample code directly in your class. We're going to make sure that this class implements iNotify property change. And you can then paste the code from the Help Center. This will be the implementation of your interface. This is an example of a property, both the private attribute and the public property with a getter and a setter. Let's adjust the code for our random number generator. You can add simple properties like integer, doubles, strings, or more complex properties like lists. Again, let's take an example and try to generate the history of all the generated numbers. Let's add a list. And as the Help Center article recommends, we're going to use an observable collection. Both should be read-only properties, and we will set this attribute a bit later in the interface asset descriptor. Let's add a trigger to notify our experience when a new number has been generated. This will be a .NET event. Let's add a constructor. This will be called as soon as the interface asset is instantiated, meaning as soon as the player or composer runs the experience. And don't forget to initialize your variables. We have our properties, which will be read-only. We have one trigger. We need an action so that from something like a button in the experience, we can ask this interface asset to generate a new number randomly. An action will be a method that does not return any value, but it will set the new values in the properties we have prepared. The method can have as many parameters as you want. In this case, let's put 2, a minimum value and a maximum value. To generate random numbers properly in .NET, make sure you have the random object and initialize it in your constructor. With this line, we are assigning the next random number between min and max value to our property. Please note I did not use the private attribute, but I used the property and its setter to make sure that base notify property change is going to be called and raised properly. This will ensure that the value will be updated on the front end in the experience. We can then add this number to our list and raise a trigger. You can note this trigger doesn't have any parameter. You can create events with different parameters, and you can get more information about this in our documentation. All right, that's it for the code. We can then build your project. To make sure Composer understands what this code is supposed to do, what are the properties, triggers, and actions, you need an interface asset descriptor. In .NET, we have a tool enabling you to generate this descriptor automatically. Back to our documentation, in this section, Assisted Generation, you have a link to download the Generate Descriptor executable. When you do that, you can just drag and drop the DLL on the descriptor exe and it will generate your IFD. Let's do it with our code. From Visual Studio, let's go to its folder, the binary, and right now we are still in debug mode. So here is the DLL. On the right hand side, I have my generate descriptor, which I unzipped on my hard drive. Taking the DLL, drag and drop on the descriptor. This opens a console. Done. Good. Press enter to close the window, and you have your IFD. I recommend you to take this IFD, add it to your project, and make sure in the properties that you always copy, at least copy if newer, this IFD into your build. This descriptor has been automatically generated, and again you have the full documentation in our Help Center, but this is where you can add some attributes or rename some attributes. For example, our generate number property, its title, we may want to name it properly with a space. And we may want to add a read-only attribute, saying that you cannot specify this property from within Composer. It is read-only. Same thing for our numbers list. Let's rename this and add the read-only property. When you're done editing the IFD, don't forget that if you regenerate it automatically, you may lose these changes. So you might want to edit this IFD manually in the future. Make sure you regenerate your solution so that the new version that you have edited in Visual Studio is copied into the build folder. Your interface asset is ready. Let's add it into Composer. First, make sure Composer is closed. You need to copy the files from your build output into a specific folder into My Documents/Intuiface. The easiest way to do that is actually to make a copy of your debug folder. So let's do a copy and paste and rename this like random number generator. Then we're going to cut this folder and go into My Documents, then Intuiface. You will see a folder named Interface Assets, probably empty on your PC. Paste your folder here. You're good to go. You can start Composer. In Composer, create a blank project and open the Interface Assets panel. Search for random. This is the one we just created. We can add it to the project and see the two properties, read-only properties, generated number and numbers list, as well as a trigger and an action. Now that your interface set is available in Composer, let's see how to test it and how to debug it using Visual Studio. First, let's focus on the test. In here, we only have read-only properties, so you can do a direct drag and drop to create some representations. It will generate some text bound to our generated number property, as well as a list, which obviously at the beginning is empty. I'm just going to edit the template quickly so it's easier to follow what's going on in this list. We then need a button to call the action to generate a new random number. And let's call the action. In our interface assets, random number generator, we have one single action with two parameters, the min and max. We didn't specify any default value, so let's go between 0 and 10. Okay. We could also have something to test our trigger. Remember, we do have a number generated trigger. We could decide to display a flashing object, maybe. So when a new number is generated, then in our scene, I will use my ellipse just as a test purpose. And I will call the show action and use the animation properties. Usually I do a quick 2 times, pretty fast, and I can preview that. So we have a little blink here. Before hitting play, in case we want to debug our code, in Visual Studio, you can use the debugger on Composer. If you click on the debug menu, you can select Attach to Process. Search for Composer and click Attach. In your code, in the method that we generated, we can add a breakpoint here, for example. It is a bit easier if you have a multiple screen setup. Let's go in Composer and hit play. When you're in play mode, you can hit the generate button, and as you can see, we go back directly to Visual Studio on our breakpoint. You can use all the step functions and check if your code behaves as expected. You can then remove the breakpoint and continue and see that each time we have a new number, we do have our trigger which is raised and the numbers are added to the list. This concludes the module about .NET Interface Assets. You will find more resources in our Help Center article as well as on our GitHub repository, github.com/Intuiface.